You've probably had this moment. You're sitting at your desk, textbook open, highlighter in hand, and you've been here for 3 hours. You've reread the same paragraph 4 times. Your notes are color-coded, your study guide is pristine, and yet when you look up, you realize you've absorbed almost nothing. Your mind feels full but empty at the same time. Meanwhile, there's someone in your class who shows up 15 minutes before the exam, flips through their notes once, and somehow walks out with a higher grade than you. And you've told yourself the story we all tell ourselves. They're just naturally smart. They're lucky. They don't care as much as you do. But what if the opposite is true? What if the person studying less isn't getting away with something, but actually doing something fundamentally different about how they process information? And what if everything you've been taught about effort and achievement has quietly trained you to work against your own brain? We've been sold a very specific story about learning. More time equals more knowledge. More repetition equals more retention. Effort is visible, measurable, virtuous. If you're not exhausted, you're not doing enough. This narrative is so embedded in our educational systems that we rarely stop to ask whether it's actually true. But there's a growing body of research suggesting that the students who study less aren't cutting corners. They've simply discovered something the rest of us were never taught. Let's start by separating what we assume from what's real. The stereotype is that people who study less are either lazy or blessed with photographic memory, that they skim the surface while everyone else does the real work. But when researchers actually study high-performing students who report shorter study times, they find something else entirely. These students aren't skipping steps, they're eliminating unnecessary ones. They're not doing less learning, they're doing less performing of learning. There's a concept in cognitive psychology called desirable difficulty. It was explored extensively by Robert Bjork, a researcher who spent decades studying how we actually retain information. And what he found was counterintuitive. The activities that feel like learning, the ones that give you that satisfying sense of familiarity and fluency, are often the least effective for long-term retention. Rereading your notes feels productive. Highlighting feels like you're doing something, but these activities create what Bjork calls illusions of competence. Your brain recognizes the material and it mistakes recognition for understanding. The students who study less have usually, whether consciously or not, figured out how to avoid this trap. They're not rereading, they're testing themselves. They're not highlighting passively, they're trying to explain concepts out loud in their own words before they've fully mastered them. It feels harder, it feels less comfortable, and that discomfort is precisely what makes it work. Think about it this way. Your brain is not a storage unit. It's a living network of connections that strengthens based on retrieval, not exposure. Every time you try to pull something out of your memory, even if you struggle, you're reinforcing the pathway to that information. But when you simply reread or review, you're letting your eyes do the work your brain should be doing. You're rehearsing familiarity, not building memory. This is why cramming feels effective but isn't. You're flooding your short-term memory with information right before you need it, and yes, some of it will be there for the test, but a week later, a month later, it's gone. Because your brain never had to fight for it. It was handed everything on a silver platter, and it forgot to build the infrastructure to keep it. The people who study less aren't working less hard. They're working more intensely for shorter periods. There's a concept called active recall, and it's one of the most researched and validated learning techniques we have. Instead of passively reviewing material, you close the book and try to write down everything you remember. You quiz yourself. You try to teach the concept to someone else, or to an empty room if you have to. It's uncomfortable. It exposes what you don't know, and that exposure is the entire point. Now, let's pause for a moment and be honest. If you're reading this and thinking, I could never do that, I need my notes in front of me or I'll panic, I want you to ask yourself something. Are you actually learning more effectively with the notes there, or are you just more comfortable? And is that comfort serving you, or is it protecting you from the very thing that would help you grow? This isn't a judgment. Most of us were never taught that struggle is part of the process.
We were taught that if something feels hard, we're doing it wrong, that if we're confused, we need to go back and reread until it clicks. But confusion is often the sign that real learning is happening. It's the moment your brain realizes it doesn't have a shortcut, so it has to build the road itself. There's a historical parallel worth mentioning here. In ancient Greece, Socrates taught through questioning, not lecturing. He didn't give his students answers, he asked them questions that forced them to construct the answers themselves. This method, now called the Socratic method, is still considered one of the most effective teaching strategies. Why? Because it requires active thinking. It requires the student to do the cognitive heavy lifting. Socrates understood something that modern education often forgets. You don't learn by being told, you learn by figuring it out. Of course, there's a difference between studying efficiently and avoiding studying altogether. If you're telling yourself you're a minimal studier, but you're actually just procrastinating and hoping for the best, that's not what we're talking about. That's avoidance wearing the mask of strategy. The distinction is simple. Efficient studiers are intentional. They know what they need to learn, they test themselves on it, they identify gaps, and they address those gaps. Avoiders hope the gaps won't be on the test. And this is where self-awareness becomes everything. You have to be honest with yourself about whether you're genuinely engaging with the material in a focused, challenging way, or whether you're just doing less and calling it strategy. The difference is internal, and only you can know which one you're doing. But if you're willing to sit with that question without defensiveness, you'll know. Here's what it really comes down to. The students who get higher grades while studying less aren't smarter. They're not gaming the system. They've simply internalized a simple truth that most people resist. Your brain doesn't care how much time you spend with the material. It cares how much you've asked of it. It cares whether you've made it work, whether you've tested it, whether you've forced it to retrieve and reconstruct rather than passively absorb. Time spent is a terrible measure of learning. Effort spent is a terrible measure of learning. The only measure that matters is whether the information is still there when you need it, and whether you can use it in a context you didn't predict. So, if you've been sitting at your desk for hours, feeling like you're doing everything right but nothing is sticking, maybe the answer isn't to sit there longer. Maybe it's to close the book, walk away, and ask yourself what you actually remember. And when you can't remember, instead of panicking, recognize that you've just identified exactly where the real work needs to happen. Studying less isn't about doing less, it's about doing what actually works and having the confidence to stop doing what doesn't. It's about trusting that your brain is capable of more than you've been giving it credit for, as long as you're willing to let it struggle a little. If this resonates with you, the next question is probably how to actually apply this without feeling like you're risking everything. We'll explore that in the next video, where we break down what active recall actually looks like in practice, and how to build a study routine that feels sustainable instead of exhausting. And after that, we'll talk about why the fear of studying less is often more about identity than ability. Because sometimes the hardest part isn't changing what you do, it's changing who you think you need to be.